Trying to get over here, so and I think Ilana. Is that gonna work, Michelle? Well, welcome. I want to welcome everyone. I'm the organizer for this session, but I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues in a second. This is the first of three presidential sessions called Distinguished Books in Linguistic Anthropology. And again, Bernard Perley, my colleague and the current president of the SLA was going to introduce this with me, but we're still waiting for his arrival. He had a little trouble getting out of Canada. But I'm so pleased that this is taking place. And I just want to announce our panelists. So we have Anna Babel, who will be discussing her 2018 book, Between Andes and the Amazon, Language and Social Meaning in Bolivia. We have Marjorie Harness Goodwin, Candy Goodwin, representing Chuck Goodwin, who will be talking about his book, Cooperative Action, which was also the winner of the 2019 Edward Sapir Book Prize. And we have Zhang, who will be talking about her 2018 book, Language and Social Change in China, Undoing Communists Through Cosmopolitan Mandarin. And just to say a few words about this presidential session, we wanted to give more attention to the forte of our field, the writing of books. And the books selected for these three sessions came from a variety of sources. They were nominated by diverse groups. They include the winners and honorable mentions of the 2019 and 2021 Edward Sapir Book Prize, and now the 2021 New Voices Book Prize. And we also had some student nominations and some other organizations who nominated the books that you see across the three presidential sessions. I'm especially pleased now to introduce Ilana Gershon, who has stuck with this since 2020, when we were originally going to have these two panels. And she graciously agreed to take on the editions of the 2021 book prize competition. So what was initially going to be two panels turned into three panels. This is the first one. Tomorrow, there will be one that takes place in the space of Gather virtually. And then there's a final panel on Saturday. And Ilana will be our master of ceremonies for all three events. We have two more people on the program who were not able to make it today, unfortunately. So this is going to be a more intimate discussion than we might have planned, but I think that's going to have a lot of rewards. So with that, I'm going to step off the stage and turn it over to Ilana.
Thank you. I have to say it's very much a treat, and I'm really secretly a little happy that I don't have to be as concerned about making sure everybody keeps to time in as rigid a way. I hate losing people, but there's a little bit of a perk attached to it. I would like to say a little bit about what exactly we're celebrating, because this has been such a long delayed celebration. And I think it is worthwhile to say a little bit about what precisely this is about. And I reflecting on this, I realized we are a community of textual travelers. All of us are in relationship to an impossible task. And this is actually a truly impossible task, which is we are spending months and years living alongside people who we record. And we are constantly taking notes about what they say, things that they might think are inconsequential or commonplace or even deeply significant, but always for their own reasons. And we take these notes while living with people who, for the most part, are not taking notes about their own daily lives. And in taking these notes, we are always orienting ourselves to a textual future. We transport these traces of memories, creating hopefully some form of distance so that we can confront an unmanageable amount of ethnographic data sitting for hours in front of screens, and these days sitting in front of screens, trying to turn all these traces of complicated social relationships into a linear narrative. And in doing so, we are creating new conversations, new insights that open up possibilities for each other, for our students, for our fieldwork interlocutors, and for many others who we cannot predict. We all write these books for many reasons, but let me be very clear. Money is not one of them. Fundamentally, these books are gifts of insights, bringing established intellectual conversations to new ethnographic contexts and transforming how and what we know in the process. And so in these presidential panels, we are celebrating that we are a community of people who generously take on this impossible task over and over again of creating linear narratives out of too messy, complicated, dull, and startling lived experience. And in particular, we are celebrating all of you. And because we are still living with the chaos of our best laid plans, in which our best laid plans are overturned, neither Chris Ball nor Brigittine French are going to be here. So what I've done is I want to ask our authors a set of questions. So this is going to be a mix of the expected and the spontaneous. Everyone has selected questions that they already plan to answer. And then it is going to be up to all of us here in this community, in this particular room, to turn this into a less anticipated conversation. So I'm going to ask each author to answer a question and then see if the other authors want to respond to what was said. And then we're going to go through a similar round of questions a second time, and then open it up for all of us to be talking and asking questions. So that is the participant structure underlying this. So, Anna, which argument that you made fills you with the most delight? What is the argument that you would like others to engage with? And which conversations in an ideal world would you like to engage with this argument? And here I'm not asking for specifics, I'm just, where would you like the argument that you just are filled with delight about to circulate, to go forth?
Ilana, this is one of those questions that my students complain about because they say, you said you're going to ask one question, but you're asking 5. Two, okay.
I'm ready to dick her down to 2.
So I know maybe not everybody here has read my book or knows my work. I work at the border of Andean and Amazonian Bolivia. I've worked there for more than half my life at this point. I first went there in 1999 in the previous century. And one of the things that I have been fascinated by for a long time is the way that people create oppositions, the way that the West is put in contrast with the East, the way that indigeneity is put in contrast with Europeanness, and especially the way that Quechua is put in contrast with Spanish. So I ended up in the town that would become my field site and my second home, sometimes my first home, because I was in the Peace Corps and I already spoke Spanish and I wanted to learn another language. I was very disappointed to be assigned to Bolivia, which shows my ignorance. But when I was assigned to this town, I asked my boss, do people speak Quechua? Because that was really what I wanted to learn. He said, oh yeah, absolutely. People speak Quechua there. But then I get there and people are like, no, we speak Spanish. No, nobody speaks Quechua here. Why would you think that? And I just started to notice that there were a lot of words I didn't recognize. There were words that had Quechua sounding phonology. There was a lot of syntax, a lot of grammatical structures that definitely didn't sound like the standardized Spanish that I was used to. So that observation became the seed of my academic work and eventually my book. And the central argument in the book is that people take the chaos of life and make order out of it. And in this case, what I was able to observe were a bunch of orderly oppositions, apparently orderly oppositions, that people kind of set up and treated as if it was completely self-evident that this set of things belonged together and that set of things belonged on the other side. So somebody who spoke Quechua would also be indigenous, would also be aligned with the socialist political movement, would probably wear a certain style of dress, the pollera, and have a whole set of signs that were assigned in opposition to somebody who was the opposite, right? Somebody who was white, who was Spanish speaking, who was pro-autonomy at that time, although that has changed. Somebody who wore a more Western style of dress, not the kind of thing that you might see in the National Geographic. So I really enjoyed the way that people did that, and I didn't realize at first how much it didn't make sense, right? That was something that my dissertation committee first pointed out to me. They were like, you were talking about Quechua, but now you skipped to dress. You were talking about the way people dress, but now you skipped to politics. And untangling that knot was really, really satisfying for me. When I thought about coming to this panel and read Ilana's questions, I was like, I don't even remember when I wrote this. So much has changed. I don't even know where we are now. My interests are totally different. Maybe it's irrelevant, but I think one of the things that Ilana is pointing out in her opening comments is that we continue to have a chaotic world. We continue to impose structure on it. And over lunch, we were just discussing how some of our consensual structures have changed through the pandemic, how political orientation has changed, how dress has changed, and we're still making meaning of those things. So maybe it's not quite fair to say that my favorite argument is the central argument of the book, but it really, really is. I will pass it on to my co-panelists at this point.
Well, I think it's a fascinating issue to study Amazon and the Andes in contact with one another. So I'm wondering if you can say something more about the Amazonian view of the Andean culture.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It's actually something that's come up several times in reviews of my books, that I don't deal much with the Amazon. So in Bolivian discourse, it's a highland-lowland opposition. The Amazon is in many ways its own region, but what we do see is influence of Guarani in material culture and in linguistic culture. Guarani is spoken kind of a little bit south of the Amazon. There's another language called Chiquitano, which is only spoken in Bolivia. It's a linguistic isolate. We also see Chiquitano loanwords for natural formations, things like swamps, bogs, etc. One of the things that happened in the Amazon that didn't happen as much in the Andes is that there was much more Hispanicization and much more assimilation to the European norm, and thus kind of an ideological construction of much of the lowlands as being Spanish speaking and mestizo or European. That's a discourse that came out very strongly in the first decade of the 2000s, and that was vigorously contested by Amazonian populations in Bolivia. For example, Evo Morales, who had cast himself as the indigenous champion of Bolivia, really only championed highland causes. He actually encouraged the construction of an incredibly destructive, ecologically destructive highway right through indigenous lands in the Amazon. And so in many ways, indigenous Amazonians allied themselves with white European lowlanders in opposition to Evo Morales and to his politics. So yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think it's a really fruitful area. I know we have several colleagues and scholars who have been working up on the Peruvian Andean Amazonian frontier, which has its own set of oppositions and also has coast, right? So within Bolivia, it's very much west and east mountains and lowlands, but there's kind of a third dimension in the coastal area. I was just going to pass it to you. I was going to say, I know your work has a lot of.
Yeah, so when you talk about the orderly oppositions, as expressed through or displayed, produced through a range of semiotic resources, including mixing languages, I guess, right? So yeah, that's kind of similar to what I was looking at, although a totally different context. So China is a very different context from what you were studying. So what I saw was orderly differentiation. There is opposition, but there's change, but then the differentiations, different groups of people are displaying or expressing, can observe. It's not random, and it's, as you know, my background in variation in sociolinguistics, it's orderly heterogeneity. So that's really nice that we could see this link between.
Yeah, and you know, I love your work. I'm a big fan, and I see a lot of similarities in the ways that people contrast different kinds of social categories and then link those with linguistic features.
Yeah. So are we going to all address the same question?
I would like you to tackle the question now.
So
what argument filled you with the most delight?
So not the chapter that I enjoy writing most, right?
That's coming up.
Okay, so
Don't worry.
I think this question might be, okay, I'll address this question first. So I will start with the central question that my book was intended to address. So the central question was, so the book is basically about language change in China. And I want to present my work as a kind of, how do we examine social change through the lens of language use? So I want to approach language change and social change as integrated. So the central question I was trying to address is what kind of a role style plays in affecting or bringing about social change. Like you said about people's clothing and hairstyle and also language. So that was the central question. And the argument I was making came from the answers that came out of my study was, the argument is, I would want to take a style-based approach to language and social change. Maybe I should explain a little bit about style. Yeah, so style is just our common sense about style. It's about distinction and differentiation, right? So how we utilize and combine resources, semiotic, including linguistic resources, to construct differentiation. So I'm taking this style-based approach to language and social change is because, as the work in my book has shown, style can address multiple dimensions that's involved in social change, including the content of about change, right? So what is new, what is different, the content. And in terms of language, the material that constitute new ways of speaking, the linguistic material, the content that constitute new ways of speaking. And maybe people are talking about new things, right? And also the content about people's ways of living and ways of feeling. So these are the content of social and language change. And style also includes the form of change. So how the form in terms of, in relation to language, how different linguistic resources are combined together and how they're used. So it's the how question, right? And how people dress to differentiate, for example, a cosmopolitan upper class urbanite from a rural person, right? So the how question, and then the meaning question in relation to language and change. What are the meanings about newness? How meaning about difference and newness? What are these meanings, right? So the meaning of tradition and cosmopolitan, the meaning about, in my study, what does it mean to be a yuppie? Or what does it mean to be a trendy expert on fashion? So how language and semiotic resources are used to create meaning, and what are these meanings, social meanings about change? So, and then the fourth aspect is ideology. Language and social change are mediated by ideology, and style is fundamentally ideological. So how we express or we perceive differentiation or newness is motivated by our belief systems. So that's why my argument is taking this style-based approach to language and social change can really offer a way to integrate, to offer an integrated approach to language change. That's my answer to that question.
Okay, I have a question. Recently, I was talking with Penny Eckert and Teresa, one of her students, and okay, I'm sorry, I got them mixed up, but they're talking about style and the chill style and teenagers and being cool, and how affect is part of this in terms of how it's expressed phonetically and in terms of how people are using their body. So I'm just wondering, do you see those kinds of issues too?
Yes, for both of us.
Well,
For me.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of affect, yes, definitely. So language variation broadly defined, although I focus more on variation in sounds, right? So language variation can index or produce affect, right? So in my own case, the local features can also be local Beijing Mandarin sound features, can also be used in the production of style to style also involves affect, right? So the cosmopolitan, for example, among the TV hosts who use this, the innovative linguistic style that uses features contrasting with the Beijing Mandarin emblematic features of Beijing Mandarin, standard Mandarin. They are also at the same time that they're performing a kind of youthful, trendy, feminine persona. It's also a production of affect, it's happiness, and it's easily relatable, conviviality. So the use of the opposite of the local features, right? So the superlocal, the newer forms can, when they're combined to perform that kind of persona, it also expresses the affect that's associated with the persona. Yeah, so I definitely see a similar stuff in my material.
Just out of curiosity, is there any creaky voice?
The creaky voice, not specifically in the data in my book, but in my what I'm doing now, the creaky voice is actually used in the performance of a so-called soft, adorable, soft, feminine persona. So in Chinese, they call the 撒娇 style. So adult, young, especially young women, they are behaving like a child, right? So to get sexual, to appear to be sexually attractive, or to to get close to their desired other, right? So they perform this kind of soft, adorable, feminine style. And in one of the examples that I had was this woman was using creaky voice. So that I haven't looked into whether, what is exactly the relationship between creaky voice and this performance of the soft, adorable femininity. But thank you for that question.
And how about dress? How does dress go along with that?
The new femininities.
Yeah.
Oh, fundamentally it goes with the dress style. Just, whatever the trendy things that would make you appear to be sexually attractive and soft, in contrast to the hard. There's the opposite of the soft, adorable femininity is what is called the manly woman. So maybe they wear, I don't know, they tend to wear short skirts these days, and long, either long, really straight hair, what do you call it? Soft, long, straight hair. So that's part of and short skirts, and I don't know. Clothing style definitely is part of it. Yeah.
It is time for you to have this very interesting moment in which you get to tell us which argument you were most delighted by when Chuck came up with it, and what do you want to circulate?
Well, I have to say it's the work on aphasia, which brings together a lot of other ideas like distributed cognition, multimodality, the idea that cognition is not located, that language is not located within the brain of a single person, but meaning making is made possible through the use of gesture, intonation, the built environment, and expanding linguistic anthropology beyond just the voice, to look at all these features. So, actually, Ilana asked this question of Chuck in 2017, and Chuck's answer to what made you most pleased about the work that you've done was his work on aphasia, because it brought to bear the idea that people who could only speak 3 words, nevertheless, can be competent speakers with the assistance of other people who are willing to take the time to interact with them to make meaning together. And I think this is such an important idea, because I'm working with students who work with not only aphasia, but other brain diseases, temporal, mental diseases, as well as autism. And Chuck's work really was very influential in people saying, yes, we can study these things. We can especially Rachel Chen, who is now at Berkeley, but she's originally from Singapore. It enabled her to see that this is a domain that we can study. Also, people like Sarah Goico, who was studying sign language in the Amazon in Iquitos, Peru, said that his looking at language in all the different diverse modalities is what gave her courage to look at sign language and to look at the embodied practices through which meaning is made. And I like it because it really brought together the importance of looking at prosody and different kinds of voice qualities with gesture and the built environment in the case of playing hopscotch to create meaning. And I think that's such an important concept. Why do I think that's important? Because it gets back to, and I'm just going to read this as part of the conclusion of Chuck's book, because I think this is what he really wanted to say to everyone. He wanted to say that the original vision of anthropology was the study of all aspects of what it is to be human. Language, diverse forms of social organization, tools, biology, our ties to other animals, from a framework able to encompass all these phenomena and investigate their mutual relationships. Study of the many manifestations of cooperative action, which is the title of his book, explores the possibility of recovering through ongoing research the integrated vision of human capacities in their full linguistic, social, material, biological, cognitive, and historical intertwinings, which sits at the root of anthropology's original radical vision of what it is to be human. And I think that vision is so important. Chuck was so interested in all the four fields. And I think as linguistic anthropologists, we must incorporate all the four fields if we want to really be relevant to other anthropologists and just as a more comprehensive meaning of what language is all about. So those are some things.
Well, I mean, this for me immediately raises an interesting question then about how does one reimagine and rethink disability?
Exactly, and that was my point at the Jennifer, what was the title of your group? It was social justice. Okay, if we're going to take on social justice, let's take on disability as well, because I know in the larger book that they were going to incorporate that sign language, but I think it's so important to. I have another quote I want to read. This I think this is interesting, where Chuck is quoting Hannah Arendt. From a phenomenological perspective, Hannah Arendt notes that what is here being analyzed as cooperative action is central to the constitution of power itself. Power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. Power is never the property of an individual. It belongs to the group and lasts just as long as the group keeps together. What strength is the natural quality of an individual seen in isolation? Power springs up between men when they act together and vanishes the moment they disperse. Disperse, yes. So that was such an important idea that Chuck wanted to promote, that if we're going to look at language, we have to look at language in an interactive context. His first paper and sort of the cornerstone of his dissertation was the interactive of a construction of a sentence, and that a speaker needs a hearer, that a sentence is not something that evolves and changes within the local ecology within which it's produced. And so he was always looking at how we need to look at the cooperation of others in the co-production of talk. It's not just a mental capacity of an individual. And just to make that clarified, this is about Chuck's father who could only speak 3 words, describing how Chill is able to act as a speaker and make meaning by tying his limited talk to the more elaborate talk of others, enables us to look at how and where a language is organized within a differentiated analytic framework, one which focuses not on processes within the individual, but on structure within the talk of a single speaker or narrator, but instead on how language is organized as a public sign system. And that was always what Chuck wanted to talk about, the public sign system, that language. By virtue of this public organization, multiple actors can use the structure of the talk that is emerging in their midst to build action in concert with each other, something well demonstrated by the extensive research, okay, like on and on, but of conversation analysis, but that's what he says. But this idea that language emerges in interaction with other people, and then we can look at disability as something that's not disability if we look at the way in which people are interacting with one another and use an incredible amount of different resources to make meaning and to tie what they're saying to the utterances of other, and use pointing, use the built environment, a number of different things. And I think that that is so important to think about enlarging the study of social justice to ableism as well.
No, I mean, I think one of the things that is so lovely about what I hear you saying is that to make it clear that someone is stably disabled is actually hard work. And that there are all these things happening socially to undercut that label at the same time. And it's an act of power to make that the stable label, right? So I want to ask the next question and then open it up to the audience. I want to ask you about the chapters that you liked to write in a different order. So, Qing, which of the chapters felt the most satisfying for you to write and why?
Because originally we were given 5 minutes, so I actually wrote some notes.
Okay.
So I don't go over time, but now. Okay, so the book, the chapter that I enjoyed writing the most was chapter 5. Warring standards, contesting the enregisterment of cosmopolitan Mandarin. That's the new Mandarin style I was looking at. So this chapter follows, is the last data analysis chapter. So there were 3 other chapters before this one that I looked into the production of style of cosmopolitan Mandarin by different groups of people. So in chapter 5, I looked into deeper, examining this new linguistic style as a socio-historical process of enregisterment. So the chapter was intended to address the question, how is cosmopolitan Mandarin interpreted and evaluated across a much wider range of Chinese language users than what I looked at in the previous chapters. And how is the emergence of the new style fundamentally mediated by changing ideologies, and how is it linked to broader social political issues? And this chapter was based on a large body of meta-pragmatic data collected for over 2 decades since the 1990s. And the analysis reveals a really highly contested nature of this enregisterment process and a more complex picture of the social meaning of cosmopolitan Mandarin. So the previous chapters reveal the social meanings more or less positive, right? The positive cosmopolitan, trendy, youthfulness. But this chapter really reveals that it's complex. A variety of social actors participates in the evaluation and construal of this new linguistic style. So this chapter really showed that variation at the micro level, specific sounds or tones can become a battlefield where larger cultural conflicts and tensions are fought among individuals and between individuals and the Chinese states. So the contesting interpretations offer strong evidence for rising awareness and recognition of the arbitrariness of the legitimacy and normativity of the conventional standard Mandarin, the common speech, based on Beijing and Northern Mandarin. And also the conflicting kind of N+ first order indexicalities or construals about the new style impact the indexical field of the common speech, right, of the conventional standard Mandarin. So in this way, the emergence of this new linguistic style kind of dismantles commonness through undoing common speech in both practice. In practice, because the new style disrupts the linguistic norms of the common speech, and also it dismantles commonness in construal or in ideology, because it disrupts the beliefs about the qualities, values associated with the conventional standard Mandarin, and also reshaping standard Mandarin's indexical field. So that's why I enjoyed this chapter the most. And also, I think it really showed that the linguistic ideological battle over enregistrement reveals what is really at stake. What is really at stake is the location of the evaluative center of a modern globalizing China, and what gets to be its legitimate voices. So I feel like I love that chapter more than the previous chapters based on production study.
If I can jump in, I really like the way that kind of you centered that on emergence and registrement and the ways in which we become aware of different markers as indexes of political stances, social categories. That's my other little obsession is awareness. And I love thinking about the ways that things become salient and become markers of identity. One of the things that reminds me of your work is the use of gender inclusive language in Spanish these days. So the competing sets of norms that are set out in order to not strip Spanish of gender, but to use neutral types of gender reference that have been extremely salient over the last few years and have engendered waves of resistance and new ways of imagining things that were not controversial before. It was a statement, not a question. Oh, I have a one-word answer to that. I find the ethnographic part really easy to write. I like writing descriptions. I like writing about people who I know really well. I like writing stories with no point, no plot, but just writing about people for me comes very easily and it's very enjoyable. I hate writing about theory. I hate theory. I really hate theory. It takes me a long time to write theory. It takes me a long time to read. Listening to you guys talk, I realize how much I stand on the shoulders of giants because I do know my theory, but it's hard for me to get it out. And so thinking about the ways that my work fits into the larger picture of kind of what we care about in linguistic anthropology and what are the stakes, which you just so beautifully articulated, and I'm super jealous. That is hard. So I actually was so dissatisfied with one of my chapters that I went and rewrote it and published it in a journal a couple of years later, because the struggle, I was trying to write about tradition and modernity, which, like, if you've ever looked at that literature, just don't bother. It is a tangle. But I wrote the chapter in the book and then was not happy with it and had to redo it. So that's my best and worst writing experiences.
Do you like the chapter that as it is rewritten now, or do you still think it needs to be covered yet again?
I'm not going to write it again.
No, I know, but like this is.
I don't think
I wasn't saying you needed to rewrite it. I was like, so I was suggesting a cover, not.
Not another original. Yeah. I don't think I said the last word on tradition and modernity, but I have it worked out to a point where I think that I said something that was accurate for the data that I had, which is about as good as I hope for. And at this point, I'm ready to move on to something else. So yeah, I'm happy with it. I don't think it's perfect, and I don't think it's the only way, but it's good enough.
I mean, I have, if I may, I have a question for both of you, which is, I have been really interested in the range of oppositions and differentiations that are available to us, and the ways in which, as anthropologists, we don't actually always think about all the different ways of creating oppositions that we have. And I'm wondering, like, how are you thinking about different ways of doing opposition in your work?
Go ahead.
Ways of doing analyzing or
No, I'm thinking actually of how people in the field create oppositions in ways that are not, like when Anna began talking, it was as if her field workers all had read a little bit too much Levi-Strauss and played with Rubik's cubes as teenagers, and despite their everyday life that was really anti-Rubik's cube, they were going to insist that that was possible. And there are moments, especially right now in the United States, where you see this this longing for kind of very clear kind of not a opposition taking place. And yet there are all these other strands of forms of opposition. Like you can have horoscopes, you can have conversations about which Harry Potter school you would go into, and all of these are different styles of oppositions. And so that our interlocutors are always indulging in. And so I'm wondering about how that was playing out in both of your research.
Differentiation and opposition. Well, I like differentiation or difference better than opposition. Now I'm thinking Gal and Irvine's signs of difference. They're everywhere. Not only we notice them, and so in this book, I was saying that I didn't study style from the analyst, well, both from the analyst perspective, but not privileging the analyst perspective on style over the people who we study, right? So I think the people pay attention to differentiation, or they notice and construct, they see things. Maybe I don't see a differentiation, but they perceive a difference. So, and that's why I think linguistic anthropology is in a really, that's where our work lies. Linguistic anthropology, we can not only document, but also reveal how difference and oppositions or differentiations are produced by the people we study. And also that's why I'm also thinking Candy was talking about language as a public science system, right? So opposition is produced, co-production of differentiation and through talk, for example, but also through gestures and facial expressions, right? So it's one person can say something in a certain way, but then once the public sees it, especially in the current context of social media, Twitter, and in China, Weibo, so the performance becomes even more public, and people participate in interpreting the whole range of signs. So my current work deals with these, a spokesperson for the government, the way that they talk, they have their own role in performing their own perspective or persona, but the public also participate in the interpretation of how they're doing their talk, especially the US-China current relation. The Western media portrays China's change in the contrast between the previous diplomatic style and the current so-called wolf warrior style. And so that's the construction of a Western construction of a contrast. And there's a Chinese perception and interpretation among mainland Chinese people on also how they interpret this change in China's diplomatic style. So I think, but then it's again motivated by ideology, how we notice and how we perceive things.
Yeah, I think I would go back to kind of the classic notion of ethnography as making the familiar strange. So when, the kinds of oppositions that all of us describe in our work are things that people take for granted. And I've told my students many times, when you go to the fields, you're not in the business of kind of picking apart the subtleties of everything that's going on. You're in the business of observing what people agree on. And in large part implicitly agree on. And there are lots and lots of processes of contestation and messiness and all of that, but the fact that there is a Kamba and a Koya social group seems self-evident, right? It doesn't seem like something that you have to describe or write a book about, right? When, the fact that there are Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals seems natural. It seems like it has always been this way. And it's when you go in a little deeper and start looking at the cracks and the historical processes that you get to the meat of what you're writing about.
Andy, do you want to talk about a chapter?
Okay, I'll talk about something different, but I think really the distributed cognition is at the heart of what's really important. But professional vision, Chuck's article, which compared archaeologists working and lawyers crafting Rodney King as the aggressor in that famous court case. I mean, the way in which Chuck was able to bring together archaeology and language in the courtroom, I think was pretty important for all of the learning sciences. I talked to so many people in education who say that professional vision, and it's in this book as well, but in a more integrated form with the idea of cooperative action. Those ideas are so central to what it means to acquire knowledge of our predecessors, which again is a point that Chuck makes, that he's looking at things not only on an immediate time scale, but he's looking at things in long-term historical context, how we inherit the culture and the practices of our predecessors. And that's what really distinguishes us and makes us as human beings from other animals. And I think that he did enjoy putting together those quite disparate things of how does somebody who's an archaeologist see in like the amorphous brown dirt, the evidence of past human habitation. When we, I, many people going out in the field schools did not see that sort of vision of what the dirt could reveal. But it's because people have training as archaeologists, because they're trained to see these different ways of the dirt is patterned, that we begin to see the evidence of past human habitation. And then to see, there are three practices that he talks about highlighting coding schemes and the articulation of graphic representations in the Rodney King trial, and how they were able to, how the lawyers were able to, through those practices, which are similar to, I mean, those three concepts are similar to archaeology and similar really to all science studies. And this is another way I'll just branch out and just say that also Chuck's work is important in workplace studies, the sociology of scientific knowledge, a number of different fields beyond anthropology, looking at sociology and cognitive science that is willing to take on a distributed cognition approach, that these ideas are important. But think about the way in which those lawyers were able to construct Rodney King as the aggressor through the way that they used graphic representations to show that Rodney King and Rodney King alone was in control of the situation, through the way that they put these images of Rodney King, and then they highlighted his body being aggressive. And then they said something like, and at point 3.8, we see his body beginning to rise. And that would put us at the beginning of our spectrum again. So then the next tool up is a metal baton. A metal baton is a tool that's used to in this kind of a case. And this, I know so many students who, were transformed by looking at how Chuck was analyzing Rodney King, the Rodney King trial case. and it allows people to see now, what's going on in all different kinds of court cases that with Black Lives Matter, et cetera. So I think that was a really important chapter, even though he says he really likes the aphasia chapter better. But this has had so much influence on the learning sciences and impact on a lot of people, I think.
Well, I would like to open it up to all of you to now make it a slightly less anticipated and predictable conversation. What kinds of questions would you like to bring to the table?
Yeah, you might want to come up to the microphone.
Hi there. Something I'm curious about, thinking about the question of theory versus and storytelling is that how did you approach that in the actual writing process? It's something I've been grappling with, as I'm starting to transition from dissertation writing. I'm curious how you approached storytelling in that way with also the more academic theoretical aspects of your books. I'd love to hear a little bit more. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, I always start by doing a lot of descriptive writing. And for me, thinking about the theoretical picture is something that comes in later. I know some people, it's a circle, it's a, theory, data, theory, data, theory, data, but I try to do the enjoyable parts first, right? So it's hard to write a book, as you know. And I find that getting going with something that gives me a little bit of momentum and, a little bit of pleasure in writing, it helps me get to the point where I'm able to think about the theory. And I am a person who tends to think by writing. And so if I write long enough, then I'll get to a point where I like, oh, this reminds me of this conversation. This reminds me of that article. This almost fits, but not quite. Now I know what I want to write about with the theory. That's how my process works. I know it's different for everybody.
So I tend to start with my data. sometimes that's immersing in the data or collecting data. I realized that we all need to put us at some point. I need to stop collecting material and swimming in my data. But that's what I usually I tend to start with the data and with my analysis and see what kind of a story I can tell. But that doesn't mean that I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. So I have like working with this book. This book is not based on one project. So it's a different, so it's not an ethnography. Two of the chapters was related to an ethnographic, larger fieldwork projects that I did. So starting with the data, I have the broad idea I had was to show language change and variation is part of social change, right? So how do I use the data to tell a social story? So the analysis of the data shows, creating of social meaning, but what is the theory? So during the analysis, then at first style was the central project. And also then, of course, I looked into, what other scholars or theories, how style has been theorized. And then you're going to tell your own story, my story, based on my data. And I'm still grappling with this process to find my own voice. So I was talking with Penny when I was writing, and she said, why do you need to cite this? You don't need to cite anybody whenever you say a sentence. Like, I think I was showing her my theory chapter 2, like where I lay out my theory on style. So I think I start with data, but I know what I'm talking about from the beginning. And then I know I kind of explore where to look for inspirations. But then I think for all of us, we also need to remember it's our own story. We build on giants, standing on giants' shoulders. But it's also important that for me, sometimes I am afraid to let my voice, to make my voice heard. But I think every time through any writing that I do, I have that moment where I feel like, okay, this is where my voice broke through, whether it's in the writing or in the revision. So that's just my personal experience.
Okay, I'm going to talk from my perspective, not Chuck's now. My original field work was with African-American children on the streets of Philadelphia. And when I got home one day, I was just so perplexed with what is going on here. I knew it was something amazing, the way that they were gossiping about other people, and I had no clue what was going on. That was the beginning of the he said, she said kind of understanding how, so I knew that in order to understand anything, this is before there was I knew anything about conversation analysis. I knew that in order to understand this, I was going to have to transcribe it and to understand how people got from utterance to utterance to make sense of this. Then I went to Bill above and he said, by the way, there are these lectures by Harvey Sachs that you might want to read to get some sense of how there is a discipline out there, which is looking at how people are getting from utterance to create meaning in a social context. Well, anyway, like I spent actually like a year just transcribing what was going on, just a year, to try to understand what a story in one context meant for building social action in a subsequent interaction. And my intent was always to show how language and stories are used to build social organization the stories that people told about what someone said about someone else behind their back were being used to reconstitute who's who in the social group according to the norms of this social group, where someone should not try to put themselves above someone else. And so I looked at, after transcribing stories across contexts, I saw the way in which a story told about someone in one context was then used to go to other people to tell about how this person had maligned the character of the person who was talked about. And then I began to see that these stories emerged as tools to reevaluate how people stood in their local social organization. So that's one way of, I had no idea what was going on at first, but I knew it was important. So, and also my advisor, Irving Goffman, said, don't be hypothesis testing, be hypothesis generating. So that always got me out to pick up something that I had no clue what was going on and to try to make meaning from it. So that, and I think that, we have to take on new things that we don't understand and try to, I think that was just a brilliant statement. But, and he would say, like, don't, when you're saying citation, don't cite up. I remember at my orals, I was citing all these people here and it can connect to this, that. He said, you don't have to cite all these other people. What are your own ideas? That's the most important thing. Don't be so frantic about putting it into all these different categories and things. Just see what you have, what's in your data that's going on. And so I think it takes a long time, to get all the data transcribed, but then you can look at it and see. I really like to look at language as it's changing through time in terms of social interaction patterns. It's different from sound change, but that's only possible with a lot of hard work. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Step into the void here as other people think of questions. And I really liked your discussion of your fascination with contrasts and oppositions. I think we all feel the interest in that. One of the most striking sets of oppositions or contrasts I've seen in the Bolivian context was at a presentation by Alvaro Fernandez Llamazares, when he contrasted the legislation for protection of the environment and environmental personhood being crafted into the Constitution, and these various different policies being made to protect the environment. And that was contrasted on the other side of the slide with the actual actions that the government had taken, which largely involve a wholesale destruction of the Amazon, the building of roads, the granting of licenses to extractive industries, etc. So I was wondering if in the course of your thinking about the Andes and the Amazon and how people conceptualize things differently depending on where they're from and where their orientation is, whether you found differences in discourse on language and ecology from these two very, very different kind of regions and sort of cultural landscapes. It strikes me that the government has always represented the view of people who've been doing agriculture for thousands of years and have a very different concept of nature from people who have been hunting and gathering and doing small scale agroforestry for thousands of years. I don't know if anything about language and ecology came out in your, thinking about these two very different parts of the country.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't do comparative field work, so I can't say necessarily what people say in different parts of the country. What I have seen is, as you say, a consistent discourse about the importance of Mother Nature, et cetera, protecting ecological rights at the same time that Bolivia is a country that's undergoing massive resource extraction and massive population growth. So over the past 10 to 15 years, I've seen an enormous increase in extractivism and in economic projects that are based on something that will result in environmental degradation. I'm not in charge of people's decisions, but I can say that for me, it's been the second saddest thing to see is the way in which, and this is across Bolivia in the places that I've been, the way in which that kind of extractive economy has gotten its grips into it. And that, I mean, that has a long history in Bolivia. Bolivia was originally of interest to Spanish colonizers because of its mineral wealth. You know, we've been through silver, we've been through tin, we've been through gas, and lithium was big for a while. And I think because Bolivia has historically had very low population density, I think there's been little attention to the ways in which conservation is important. I would say that the Amazon has not traditionally been a center of power. And that's one of the reasons why it is in many ways bearing the brunt of these policies. But I also wouldn't underestimate the extent to which Amazonian people reshaped the landscape. The more we learn about the Amazon, the more we understand that much of the ways that the rainforest, as well as the less forested parts of it, have been managed for centuries by human behavior. You know, another piece of that is the drug industry, which I have a policy of not talking about cocaine in my academic work. I have a policy of not asking about cocaine in my field work. I feel like that's one of the things that keeps me personally safe. But it's also true that for many years, the Bolivian economy was driven by the exportation of cocaine, a renewable natural resource. And so the ways that American drug policy has shaped that kind of need for extractivism, I think is also an interesting question to ask. Thank you for the question.
Question about how, and this could be a function of how the West understands China and the China state system, but what has been the state's response to this burgeoning cosmopolitan dialect? Is the state aware of it? Is the state propagating it? And if I understood your earlier comments, is it a differentiation between urban Chinese and rural Chinese, or is it a subset of the urban population within China?
Thanks, George. Yeah, the state is definitely aware of this new way, this new style of Mandarin. So part of that enregistrement chapter included, you know, different, so I call it social actors, perception and evaluation. That includes, you know, material from state discourses about this deviant way of speaking Mandarin. Yeah, so definitely they're aware of it, and also the noticing of the difference was also highlighted in state media events, including the most watched Chinese CCTV's Chinese New Year televised gala. So in multiple years, the performance or the mock performance of the use of the emblematic features of the new style were very often used in the New Year CCTV's New Year's skits. So those skits are, you know, sanctioned, I guess. Yeah, so that you will see multiple years these how they mock the new style in terms of in contrast. We come back to this issue of contrast again. The new way of speaking contrasting with standard Mandarin on one side, and rural local regions that are dialects that are registered to be associated with rurality, right? So there's that's multiple years of these gala performances. So the state did notice it, and the noticing is ideological, right? So they're making their perspective clear, right? So this new accent was perceived as very often were used by characters who are modern, very often becoming a modern, upwardly mobile, wealthier Chinese, but somehow it's a facade. All what's shared among these characters, it's fake. Actually, they're not some kind of successful, for example, a successful business person. Actually, this person was working as a construction worker, but after he went back to his village, he took on this accent to show that, oh, he's doing really well, right? So the contrast is three-way or two-way. Three-way contrast, it's the real authentically modern Chineseness is very often these shows somebody would come out and say, talk normally, right? So that voice is the standard Mandarin, right? But then the fake modern is the new accent. And also the rustic modern roots, when they went back to the village and they switched back to their native dialect, is that the modern roots, rustic roots is the local rural dialect. Yeah. So and so you asked about the urban and rural connections.
Is synonymous with Beijing, or is it
Not just Beijing. So cosmopolitan is not. It's not associated with a particular region. However, these new features, especially the tone variation and the specific Beijing feature of adding the roticization, adding the R sound, and the de-roticization, that is the origin, the first noticing of the contrast came out of the noticing of different Chinese coming from overseas, coming from Taiwan or Hong Kong, right? So it's the coastal, it's the overseas. That was the very, very early days of the noticing. And then, but these two features were also shared among the southern varieties of Chinese. Yeah, but cosmopolitanism is not associated with a particular region. However, it is, well, there is an association with the coastal regions, especially the southeast coastal region of China.
Hi. Thanks to all of you. My question is about what happens next. You've produced wonderful books, and Candy has also produced wonderful work of her own besides Chuck's work. And so, but talking about such work, there's a bit of a looking backward in doing so. Now, what did you like about doing this, or what did you find? So what comes next for each of you? What are you moving on to?
Okay, I am writing a book in concert with my husband's cardiologist and doctor and a phenomenologist on living towards death. His cardiologist became sort of like his palliative care doctor, although he didn't have any, it wasn't officially that. And for 2 years, he recorded the conversations between Chuck and him. And then he was more like an anthropologist that you could ever imagine, because he told us that he was going to record everything that we did, you know, when we had interactions together, but he also recorded like at parties, when we had dinner together, all these informal conversations. And so what I'm looking at is how Chuck came to accept death as a part of living. Part of the One day I was at the medical consultation in his office, and Chuck was talking about some very existential moment in his fear of dying. And the doctor reached out and held his hand and continued to hold his hand. I'm very interested in touch, as many of you know. So that was just like such a beautiful moment of the way in which touch can really be very healing in the midst of very traumatic kind of situations. So I'm looking at, people are talking about storytelling. I'm looking at the stories that Chuck and his doctor tell one another, and the kind of metaphors, the kind of Chuck invokes King Lear, Macbeth, everything, and talking about how he's feeling. So I'm looking at all these kinds of interactions in concert with, it turns out that his doctor, Mario Deng, has written a book with his wife, Federica Raya, on relational medicine. They're all into how medicine should change to be more in tune with showing concern for the other person rather than the kind of capitalist model that we have now in the United States of 15 minutes and you're out. In his practice, working with advanced heart failure patients, people have an hour to express what they want to do, what they feel about what they feel about their current situation. And as a matter of fact, in the first encounter that Chuck had with him, he talked about the inevitability of death in Heidegger. So, and his wife, Federica Raya, who teaches in education, is a phenomenologist. So together we're trying to write about living towards death. And I think, I'll just say that I think this is very important in American context to come to terms with how we can accept death as a part of living. So I want to write that story. And also we have interactions between Chuck and all his students, because Chuck had a lab that met every week. People came from around the world to study with Chuck. And so we have the interactions, Chuck explaining very explicitly what was his medical condition at a particular point, and what his cancer was like, and what the prognosis was. And then people writing back to him. And as a matter of fact, and so one of his students said, in writing and reflecting on these interactions, said, Chuck was not only a mentor in social interaction, he was a mentor for how to live towards death. So I think all these kinds of things to make dying more out in the open is something that we should be talking about. And you know, that's my current project.
So one thing I'm working on is directly related to what I was doing in the book. This directly related in the sense that I was still looking into the mediatization and the evaluation of the so-called Taiwan accent. And that's it's meta-pragmatic label referring to new way of speaking Mandarin, right? But so the mediatization of it and the evaluation of it on Chinese social media is really interesting. So I'm focusing on performing femininities. So the new style of Mandarin, including its emblematic features. At the end of that book, I mentioned that I'm not saying that we could define what standard Mandarin is. There's no clearly defined boundary. And the new Mandarin style is part of the repertoire of standard, what is the so-called standard Mandarin. So in this, what I'm doing now, looking into the performativity of different femininities, I'm trying to show that the incorporation of this new style, the expansion of the Mandarin, standard Mandarin, also offers an expansion of the repertoire of performing femininities. So earlier I mentioned there's this soft, adorable, childish femininity in contrast to the so-called women, the more rough and down to earth femininity is the Taiwan, so-called Taiwan accent plays a very important role in creating this contrasting femininities. It doesn't mean that, and it's also related to Northerners because they speak Northern Mandarin, are not able to perform the soft femininities. But Northerners do the kind of adorable, childish femininities all the time. But it's now that this soft type of femininity is associated with this new accent, right? So it's the perception of the contrast, linguistic contrast, mapping onto evaluation and perception of the different kinds of femininities associated with the soft and hard qualities are one of the things that I'm working on now. And then another project is related to the, also related to style, but in the form of, I'm trying to connect style again to social change. In this project is the change in the Chinese, how China present itself on the, in the global geopolitical stage. So this state project of telling China's story effectively and spreading China's voice. So it's been going on for, it's present, initiated by Xi Jinping. It's been going on for quite a few years. So I'm looking into how style plays a role in spreading, telling China's story with spreading China's voice. So the focal point, the social actors or stylizers are the spokespeople for the Chinese foreign ministry, China's foreign ministry, the spokespeople. They have daily press conferences. So it's really interesting to see the similarities and differences among the three spokespeople and how they represent China and addressing questions, and how Western perception of the change from restrained, reserved to aggressive, to being aggressive, the kind of wolf warrior style, and looking at how the Chinese mainlanders perceive their, also perceive this change in the, using the three, looking into the styles of these spokespeople. So it's also language, of course, language plays an important part in it, but and style is fundamental because they are combining different resources from registers, right? Different registers, a variety of registered resources are used in these spokespeople styles. And one of them, the Western media's supreme, China's supreme wolf warrior style is one of the three. His style is the most flamboyant, and his style covers the widest range of enregistered resources, including the use of roticization and of course other things. So that's what I'm working on now. I've collected a lot of data, but I'm still in the, swimming in my data phase.
All right, y'all, this is a little bit embarrassing. So 12 years ago, Judy was on my dissertation committee, and this question definitely came up, and the answer has not changed. So I I have been working towards a project on how migration shapes awareness of language. And I've done some field work in Barcelona where there's a very large Bolivian community, and I have funding to go do some more field work this summer with a graduate student, looking at how different kinds of features are available at different levels of awareness. So this process that we were talking about making things salient, linking them to indexable features and how that changes over the course of the lifetime. It's a project I have wanted to do for a long time, and life has been getting in the way for a long time, but maybe, fingers crossed, it's going to happen now.
I think this is a wonderful note to end on. To end on anticipating the future challenges of turning all this material into a linear narrative yet again. But these are wonderful gifts that you are giving us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mask.